Welcome everyone to this event, Activism and Optimism with Local Politicians. It's good to see so many people here. It's good to see our panelists, and thank you guys so much for agreeing to be a part of this evening. We're really excited to kind of create this conversation around sustainability and the climate crisis between the young people of St Albans and the district and their politicians. To begin with, I'm just going to quickly share my screen and just give people an idea of who's in the room today and kind of what their main issues that they are interested in are. So we did a pre-event survey, and from this we can kind of see that most people are around school age. They do feel quite able to get involved in tackling the climate emergency, which is good, but obviously there's room for improvement there. And in terms of concern about the climate and ecological emergency, it's quite high, as you'd expect at an event like this. So our next slide just shows kind of the main themes that people think are important. So the top three are waste, decarbonisation, including kind of energy use, biodiversity and nature, and sustainable lifestyle coming slightly further back from those. And in terms of the way in which they think young people could be better involved, a lot of people see meaningful interaction with local politicians as a way to do that. So that's a good idea for this evening. And climate education in schools. And then we also had two suggestions of youth organised advisory group that would be able to speak on particular policy issues to the people in charge, and lowering the voting age to 16. Next, I'm going to move over to Jess, who's going to, for the people in the audience who maybe don't know so much about local politics, just quickly outline the role that people on the panel have and the ways in which they kind of have the power to make the change. So over to you, Jess.
So we're going to start with MPs at the top, who are members of Parliament elected by the public into the House of Commons. On this call, as you can see, we've got Bim and Daisy Cooper. They represent their constituency, which is their area, so Hitchin and Harpenden and St Albans, and also a party in the House of Commons, but they have the wider national interest to consider when making decisions. This level is most responsible in terms of climate things for things like national budget and decisions made at COP in November. Then we've got councillors. So councillors have a sole focus on the community and are elected by the public in local elections, such as the one that some of you maybe voted in last month. Again, their job is to represent the people who elect them and work with them and partners such as local businesses and other organisations, but they deliver on local priorities more. There are different levels of local authority that you may have heard, such as London boroughs, district, city, county councils, which all differ depending on where you live. But on this call, we have Tina, who is a county councillor. County councils are responsible for things like social care, education and transport. And we've also got two district councillors, Will Tucker and Simon Grover on this call, who are responsible for a slightly smaller area and services like rubbish collection or recycling and house planning. So in summary, local councillors take on local issues and MPs focus on more national and constituent issues.
Perfect, thank you, Jess. So now if I can hand over to our panelists to give you a short introduction to who they are and kind of what they're all about. So if I go to Bim first, if that's okay.
That's fine, thank you. And thank you, people who are joining. It's a real pleasure to be here, and soon I hope to be able to do this sort of thing in person, as I'm sure all of you do. I was first elected in 2017 as Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden. My interest in this issue did not come from when I was at school, for example. It didn't come from that point. When I was at school, this issue was not really talked about very much. We talked about the ozone layer, but that was basically what I can remember. And it grew within my 20s. And when I was first elected, it was one of my first meetings where I had with the Committee on Climate Change, some of the members from the Committee on Climate Change, which the government set up to advise on environmental issues. And the way they laid out the challenge for the country, indeed the world, really struck me. It moved it from something that I thought was fairly important that I thought I was maybe going to have to be involved with in some way, to something that I thought was an existential challenge for government, for this country, and indeed the wider world, because all our way of life, whether it be how we get to work, what work we do, how we enjoy nature, our family life, everything is sort of predicated upon the world functioning, broadly speaking, as it does today. And if we get that out of balance too much, whether it be through temperature, whether it be through biodiversity loss, whether it be through air pollution, then the world as we know it will not be there for our children, grandchildren, and for further generations. And when you think about it in that context, I think it's how I frame my look at this issue, whether it be in day-to-day politics or indeed policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bim. And now could we go to Daisy?
Well, I had a very right-on mother, and she taught me all about the climate crisis when I was from the age of about 3. And when I was growing up, I remember being very, very scared about acid rain. And this was an environmental disaster in the early 80s. It was killing off forests and lakes and wildlife and biodiversity, but it's also a success story because it was a disaster that got turned around as a result of cutting edge science, media coverage, and people working cross-party actually to draw attention to an issue. So I grew up with this threat to acid rain, planting trees. I was living in rural Suffolk. I was trying to flog them to London holidaymakers who used to come and visit the coast, and then moved on to other campaigns as I was growing up, like campaigning against school uniform that I couldn't afford and having enough computers for those of us at university that didn't have laptops. And so I was always a campaigner at heart, and it was only really in my late 20s that I got involved in party politics. And I got involved for very different reasons, but I've always carried my concern for the climate and for the planet and for the environment with me from a very young age. Now that I'm an MP, I was elected in 2019 as the MP for St Albans, and since I've been an MP, there are sort of 2 things that I've been focusing on. One is that I'm education spokesperson for my party, the Liberal Democrats, and that means that I've been meeting with lots of groups of young people as well as campaigners who want to look at things like climate education and how we decarbonise our schools and our colleges and those kinds of issues, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. But the other thing was that one of the first things I did when I got elected was to join the all-party parliamentary group on climate change. Now, I'm sure you'll hear lots of us this evening. We're all from different parties. We'll probably have different points of view. We might want to sort of, say that each other are doing enough or not doing enough or what have you. But fundamentally, this is an existential issue. And for me, I thought it was so important that I could work cross-party. And one of the things I'm really proud of is that this cross-party group in Parliament has recently launched something called a climate dashboard. And I might just pop the link in the chat later, because I know that between now and COP, there's going to be loads of announcements. There's going to be lots of detail. It's going to sound very complex. There'll be big sums of money talked about, and it'll be very confusing for a lot of people. But this cross-party group in Parliament has developed this climate dashboard, which is a really simple, easy way to understand what the government of the day is suggesting it's going to do and how far that goes to helping us with our decarbonisation agenda. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Now if we go to our county councillor, Tina.
Hello, so I'm Tina Bartwise. I was elected to Hertfordshire County Council last month. I'm a Labour councillor and I represent a division in Letchworth Garden City. So I became politically active at the age of 17. Many people on this call will be that age. And I joined the Labour Party because I felt that our communities needed to see change. And that very much came through my background, the people around me, and my experiences as a trustee and volunteer in the charity sector. So I have an environmental background. I've been passionate about the environment since I was a child, much like Daisy. So from joining eco groups in school to, so I went to Hitchin Girls' School, where we actually got rid of plastic in the canteens, and that's something that I spearheaded, as well as different coloured bins for different types of waste. So I used to coordinate the youth wings of climate change groups across the county. This is something that was really important to me because it meant that I could create forums for young people like the one you've created here today. But it also meant that I was able to lobby district and county councillors and also help to organise protests. And now that I'm on the other side of that, I've taken all of those things with me. So as I mentioned, I'm a Labour county councillor, but I'm also the youngest councillor ever on that particular body. And I think that that's significant tonight because we're talking about the involvement of young people. I should also mention I'm the Labour spokesperson on this council for the environment and waste. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And now, Will, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good evening, I'm Will. I'm a Lib Dem councillor in central St Albans, an area called St Peters. And I've been a councillor since May 2019. Last year I was chairing the District Council's Climate Advisory Group, which advised the council on establishing our climate emergency and sustainability strategy. So that's the kind of the local politics angle. But before I got into party politics, I was involved in, well, I still am involved in running campaigns on climate change. So historically I ran Oxfam's UK climate change campaign, including funding the foundation of the UK Youth Climate Coalition. And now I work for the Wellcome Trust, which is a medical research funder. And I'm quite heavily involved in developing our new strategy on climate change and health, including our preparations for the UN conferences that are going to be happening in Glasgow in November. So I'm quite involved at the local level, all the way up to the global level.
Amazing, thank you. And Simon, finally, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Simon. I'm a Green councillor here in St Albans. I went to Francis Bacon School, now Samuel Ryder, some of you might know. And my political life started at school. So when I was in the sixth form at Francis Bacon, I ran the school magazine, and there was a general election one year when I was there. And so for an article for the magazine, I sent off for all the manifestos from the main parties, and I included, as well as the main parties, I included what was then called the Ecology Party, now known as the Green Party. So I read through those manifestos and did a little article on them. And I read through the Ecology Party manifesto, and I just found it absolutely, it just kind of blew my mind, really. It basically pointed out that our economy and our society is based on the idea of infinite economic growth, of producing and consuming more today than we did yesterday, and more tomorrow than we did today, forever, without end. And it pointed out that infinite growth is impossible on a finite planet. You are going to run out of raw materials and resources and land at some point. At some stage, the world around us, our environment, was going to start to have problems with what to do with the waste from all the stuff that we produce, whether that's plastic waste or nuclear waste or air pollution or water pollution or greenhouse gas. And I was really, really inspired by that idea. And that all the hopes and dreams that all the other parties talked about in their manifestos were going to come to nothing if they didn't deal with this issue of infinite growth. And they weren't even talking about it. And the only ones who were the Greens. And on the inside of that front cover of that manifesto was a quote from a guy called Schumacher, who wrote an amazing book called Small is Beautiful, which I really recommend. It's a wonderful book, and it questions modern society's obsession with everything getting bigger. And the quote was, I just looked it up before the meeting, I don't know off by heart, the quote was, "We must do what we conceive to be the right thing and not bother our heads or burden our souls with whether we're going to be successful, because if we don't do the right thing, we'll be doing the wrong thing, and we'll just be part of the disease and not part of the cure." And that really inspired me too. And I wanted to be part of this cure that he was talking about. So I joined the Ecology Party, changed its name to the Green Party. I got involved in local politics. I moved to London, got involved in the local Green Party there, moved back to St Albans, and then eventually became a councillor in 2011, and I've been re-elected 3 times since then. So I'm really interested in what local government can do to promote and achieve a more sustainable world, the sort of world that Schumacher talked about, particularly now, of course, tackling the climate emergency. And to do that, I work with other councillors and council staff, and I put pressure on them to prioritise these issues. So that's me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's good to see that you all come from such kind of diverse backgrounds and different ways into the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. I just want to say before we start the questions, if anyone in the audience has any questions at any point during the evening, just pop them into the Q&A and we'll try and kind of address those alongside the pre-submitted questions that we've got. So if we move on to our first question, the idea of kind of declaring a climate emergency has kind of gained a lot of currency over the last few years, and over 400 councils and the national government have now declared one. We have a question from Thomas, who is a new district councillor in Redbourne and is 18.
Yes.
Yes, and he asks, what kind of transformational change has been delivered locally since that declaration here? And also, I guess we would add to that, how has your day-to-day kind of experience of politics changed since that climate emergency declaration? If anyone wants to pitch in and go first, go ahead.
If you're asking about the district council, Simon and I maybe could lead off. We've both been heavily involved in that committee I mentioned before. I think the biggest transformation is almost a mindset change at the district council, wherein every leader at the district council, every team leader, every head of department, all the way up to the CEO, has been asked, and we are kind of checking up on the fact that they are focusing, every decision is taking into account the climate emergency. And so whether it's building new social housing, whether it's looking at how we redevelop parks, whether it's looking at our recycling rates, every decision in the council's business is being looked at now with a climate lens, as well as with a cost lens and a benefit to society lens. And so whilst that's not one thing, it's kind of everything, but it's one change. Simon, I don't know if you would add.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Will. In answer to the question, what transformational change has there been? I'd say there hasn't been one that you'd noticed by looking out your window. And I think it's really vital that if we're to take people with us on this journey, the people on this call are really into all of this subject, but a lot of people outside have got busy lives and they're not so interested. What is really important is that we have things that we can point at and say, look, that's what we mean by this sort of change. And I think there's been a lot of good talk from the council, and that's great, and I've been encouraging that, but actually it really needs to turn into action. So all sorts of things like we should be putting solar panels on all council houses. That hasn't happened yet. There's a talk about it. We should be helping people to insulate their homes so the demand for energy is less. There's been talk about that. I've got a promise that that's going to happen, but there's no sign of it yet. So there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of people are talking about it in a way that they didn't 10, 20 years ago, but unfortunately it is still talk, and there is that we're running out, we have run out of time for talk. We need to get onto action now, and that is true at national and international level, and it's also true at local level.
Shall I offer, I'm happy to offer a sort of a more national perspective on this. I mean, I guess what I would say is when the Lib Dems took control of the district council in 2019 as a minority administration, the very first thing that local Lib Dems did was declare a climate emergency. And now there are 100 climate projects that have been started. If you look at the Hertfordshire County Council, Liberal Democrats on Hertfordshire County Council have raised the question in every budget meeting of the County Council for 10 years. Liberal Democrats have asked for more funding for cycle lanes and other environmental projects related to that. The problem is that all around the country, there are local councils, some run by Lib Dems, some run by Conservatives, some run by Labour, some run by other people. But district councils are finding it very hard to do anything transformational because they don't have the money or the powers that they need. And one of my big frustrations is that communities around the country are chomping at the bit to see more action that they can see outside their window on their doorstep. Communities are chomping at the bit, councils are chomping at the bit, but government is dragging its heels because government inevitably is very slow moving. If government can actually delegate powers and money to district councils and to county councils, then we would see a lot more transformation happening, and you'd see it a lot faster because the demand is there. So that's where the hitch really is.
May I come in?
Yeah.
I think that Daisy's only right up to a point. I've got huge respect and time for Daisy, indeed for all of the people on the call, so I don't want to make this overly party political. So I think that the issue, yes, there is an issue around district and county councils with their resources. I think that's definitely true. However, at the same time, some of this is a problem of our political culture, and some of it is a problem with individual places. And let me explain what I mean. Our political culture is still one at which people at different levels are trying to point the finger at somebody else for not doing as much as they should, or somebody should do more, and the government should do more, or this council should do more, etc. And what that does is it means that the government gets nervous by effectively just saying to councils, we're just going to give you money, blank check, extra money that's obviously being diverted from somewhere else, and then saying, well, okay, and then the council then may or may not do sensible or good things with that. Now, I'm not saying St Albans District Council wouldn't, I'm just making the broader point. So really, what is it I think the councils can do more of, and what do I think the government needs to do more of? The councils can raise more money locally. There are ways in which councils raise more money. County council raises more money through council tax, for example, if it wants to raise it. District council can raise money, for example, through car parking charges and various other things. There are ways in which councils can raise more money. At the same time, what the government needs to do is to trust councils a bit more and accept and try and accept that councils in different areas are going to do different things in different ways. How would I do that? Simon mentioned the point around housing. Now, for me, building new houses, it is bonkers that we are not moving faster to make sure that we have the absolute highest standards in terms of insulation and heat loss, energy loss. There shouldn't be a new house built in St Albans district, whether they be built by the council or built by a private developer, that does not reach those standards. But at the same time, we need to, at national standard, and this afternoon, I was in Downing Street speaking with some of the COP26 team. We need to nationally mandate that housing developers do more on their absolute national standards so that it's easier for the council to do something. So really what we need is more partnership between national and local government. That does require, from a local government perspective, for local government to resist trying to blame government for little things in terms of in a party political way, because when that happens, then those partnerships don't work so much. On issue that I think we all agree is so important, it should be beyond the sort of typical party politics.
Thank you. I want to come in here and kind of take us through a journey. So I want to start from the perspective of political parties. Something I think that prior to these declarations, it's about raising awareness, and having these declarations mean that it's impossible to ignore. It also means that as an electorate, as members of the public, we're able to hold people to account based on the promises that they've made. So with political parties, Labour's manifesto in the county council elections had a specific section on the environment, but what was significant is that the environment actually ran throughout, and it's about bringing the community with us, as has been mentioned. So one of the things that Labour was proposing we do in Hertfordshire is have a climate change initiative fund, which would then bring money into the community so that people already doing work on this in the community can have the resources to do that. And I don't really want to make this overtly political, I guess, but I am going to disagree with Bim, because I think that there is a funding issue where local government is concerned, and it cannot be just put down to mismanagement, because local councils are really struggling, and that's Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, etc., administrations alike. So yeah, the county council, something I want to encourage people to get involved with at the county council is there will be a Hertfordshire-wide COP26. I think it's really important that young people get involved with that and have their voice heard on that platform.
Thank you very much to our panelists on that first question. I think there's a lot of views, but the kind of stream of working together and overcoming a problem that's kind of bigger than political divides kind of really shone through there. I guess that kind of extends to our second question, which is about coronavirus pandemic recovery and how to support local businesses on high streets and also a sustainable recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. Maybe something brief on how you think that you can influence this process so that the recovery is both kind of strong but also sustainable.
Who do you want to go first?
I'm happy to go first if.
Yeah, sounds good.
So I think we're at a very, very important juncture. We need to effectively transform our method of production and of energy, more generally manufacturing and of energy production, and our transportation systems. And we know we need to do that in order to reach net zero by 2050, which the Conservative government legislated for a few years back. Now, if we take this opportunity by incentivizing innovation in the private sector with the right steer from government, using COVID as a model, government's great at some things, private sector's good at other things. Working those two things together, we can create a lot more jobs, high-paying, good quality jobs in the growing sectors of the future. If, however, we fall back on effectively the old economy in order to do that, then we will not achieve our target by net zero, and those jobs won't be sustainable, let alone the environment. So, and I know the Prime Minister is always banging on about this, and he does it in private and in public, but it is up to us now over the coming months and years to show you that we are very, very committed to this, and we are. And I think that economically it's going to be great for young people, just like people on this call.
So it's a question about local businesses on high streets, which is, so I think there's a local business angle on high streets, but there's also sort of big business too. I guess some of the things I would say is that many of our businesses in St Albans, I know less about the ones in Harpenden, but many of our businesses in St Albans are already very sustainable. There's at least one restaurant that has 30 different indicators of how their food is sustainable in terms of where they get their meat from, in terms of what they do with the oil that's left in the pans, in terms of the packaging that their food comes in terms of the transport miles attached to where they get their food supply from as well. So I think it's really important to support those particular businesses, and that's incumbent on all of us as consumers to spend the time researching which businesses are sustainable and have sort of sustainable products. The second thing I would say is actually pedestrianisation is a very good thing. It's good because it creates a nicer environment, it improves the air quality, it also makes for a nicer experience, it's better from a pandemic point of view, but it also means that people spend longer in local shops, which is good for our high streets. Two other things I would say, now these are quite sort of techie things, but the first is we have this horrible tax called business rates. And business rates are a completely broken system. And I'm not going to bore you to death with how they're calculated, but in effect, they're linked intrinsically to the cost of houses. So where you have an expensive place like St Albans, these little shops, these little independent shops on our high street are absolutely paying through the nose these really big taxes for business rates, whereas really big companies like Amazon have these big warehouses out in the middle of nowhere and they pay hardly any tax at all. Now, the reason that this is important for the climate is because if these small businesses that are already paying lots of local business rates, if they improve their particular shop front by having solar panels or something, that actually increases the value of their property. It means they have to pay more by way of business rates. So actually they are disincentivized. And one of the ways you could support local businesses would be to reform the business rate system. The very last thing I would say is a green investment bank. This was something that Liberal Democrats set up when we were in government. Unfortunately, the Conservatives scrapped it a few years ago, but they are now talking about bringing it back. So all I would say to BIM is please support those proposals and do everything you can to encourage the government to re-establish the Green Investment Bank, because we really need to attract private investment into the future green jobs.
Thank you very much. Can I just pop into the discussion as well? We've had a question around, I know you spoke about kind of consumer responsibility, Daisy, but a question around whether the change should come from the companies or from the individuals, and where you think responsibility lies.
So because I'm a liberal, I don't really like banning things. Liberals always see banning things as a last resort. And there are some things that we think ought to be banned, like, you know, single-use plastic, for example, that's in our manifesto that we want to ban that within 3 years. But we do, wherever possible, try to incentivize people and look at things like regulation. And I think it's really, really important that this is where government plays its part. Government can put regulation in place to force businesses to do things. So the honest answer is everybody's got to do their bit, but there's only so much that individuals can do. And actually, whilst individuals can do things like look at their own water usage, you know, turning the lights off, turning the taps off, you know, walking and cycling rather than using the car, fundamentally, major emissions come from housing and from transport, and we do need regulation in place to make sure that everything these industries do moves us closer towards net zero.
Look, just on that, Daisy's right, insofar as, yes, everybody needs to play their part, and she's right about regulation. However, I want to say something slightly tougher in terms of individuals. Individuals, in terms of their personal action, can only do so much. But in the coming years, I think people are going to start to notice that there are going to be some very, very difficult decisions for the government around the things we need to do and to change how people do things in order to reach net zero, whether it be the way people heat their homes, whether it be insulation, whether it be the way you get around, whether it be taxes on certain carbon producing activities. And what I'd urge is that individuals need to take their part by not unduly punishing politicians or policies, where politicians are going to have to say, look, this is something that you may not like, but it's really important for us to achieve this goal. And the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, whether the public responds to that responsibly and says, okay, I can see why you're doing that, or whether they punish the politicians or the parties or whatever who propose certain things. Because if individuals do punish them at election time when they propose those things, the next set of politicians you get won't propose those things, and in 10, 15, 20 years' time, we'll be in a difficult situation. And I think that really will be the acid test as to how responsible people really are when it comes to this issue.
Could we have a local perspective on this? So kind of what is happening locally on these issues?
I'm happy to do that. Thank you. So I think part of it is recognising the good work that businesses are already doing and promoting that. But I think it's all a cycle. So one of the things that the Labour Party proposes to do is subsidising public transport. And I think that that's really important in the wider picture of sustainable towns. But I want to agree with the things that have been said about promoting what businesses are doing and partnership working in terms of national and local government. But I wanted to add something, and that was partnership working with the charity sector. So I'm a charity trustee. One of the things I want to spearhead is a more sustainable charity sector. And I think that this is a really exciting time actually to be doing that, because I think that in many ways, businesses and the charity sector can learn from each other. And I think that that partnership will be really valuable going forward.
So both Simon and I are ward representatives for the High Street in St Albans, and I'd probably go back to something Simon introduced right at the start, although possibly with a little less vim, and that is the mantra reduce, reuse, recycle. We do need to change our consumerism, and we are consuming too much, and we have to kind of be honest about that. I wouldn't take it as far as to say we can't ever consume new things ever. But I do think we need to be thinking about what it is that we buy, whether we need things, buying things that last, making things that last, building things that can be repaired. And as Daisy's referred to, a lot of that takes regulation. In terms of the local high street, specifically in St Albans, actually we've got a really active business community in St Albans who are working on this agenda, both in their own businesses, but also together. So they organise themselves in what's called a business improvement district. And that's where they all chip in extra money on the high street in order to make improvements to the high street, but also in order to help them kind of work together on shared challenges. One of those challenges is buying energy. And so that the Business Improvement District already has a project which is helping businesses to buy in green electricity, so solar, wind produced energy, rather than fossil fuel produced energy. And I think those are, again, the sorts of initiatives that we need to be supporting local businesses to be able to buy into. Just on the international businesses, I think many of them are, or no, some of them are getting well ahead of national government, certainly, on these issues. So you look at companies like Aviva, Legal & General, Unilever, many of those big global companies have the ambition to reach net zero for their own companies by 2030, by 2040. And I think those are the sorts of companies that we need to be showing support to as consumers if we're going to get to the kind of tipping point of public pressure, which Tina and Bim have mentioned already, in order that governments then can take the most ambitious action that we need them to take.
Perfect, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I think we'll move on to the next kind of set of questions, which are around practical policy and the concerns that the young people who submitted questions had in terms of this. So in answering these questions, if you could maybe touch upon kind of procedure and how these things would go through the policy process and what would need to happen for them to become reality, that would be ideal, just to kind of keep us in the loop of how governing actually happens. The first one we've had a lot of questions around plant-based diets and the need to cut down on meat and dairy intake, and maybe the relative neglect of this as a means of kind of fighting the climate crisis by government. So some of the questions we've had are from Arthur, Olivia and Jess about promoting changes to diet in schools, and also broader societal changes such as kind of positive and negative incentives to local businesses to become more plant-based, and maybe information campaigns around the actual impact that a diet that's kind of heavily based in meat and dairy actually has. If we start with Daisy maybe as kind of an education spokesperson.
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is when it comes to the food you're eating in your own school, you haven't got to wait for the government to do anything at all. Go and talk to your teachers, create a fuss, run a petition, talk to your head teachers, write to the Board of Governors, ask them to look at who provides the food to the school. This is something that you can really do something about. So the first thing is, take it on board and run with it. I guess the next thing I would say is a broader policy is that there is absolutely no doubt that the more people that switch to a plant-based diet or a largely plant-based diet, the more we can, the more faster we can reduce carbon emissions. There's no doubt about that. But I also think it's really important that we don't demonize people who do eat meat, and we certainly don't demonize those people who produce meat. Now, the reason for that is that because you really, rather than just want to say meat is bad and vegetables are good, actually you need to look at the way in which this stuff is produced. And actually a lot of meat in this country is produced in a sustainable way. And farmers in this country have a really important role in being stewards of the land. And if you want to have, for example, really good soil health, if you want soil to be healthy so that plants can grow in it and so we can grow all sorts of all sorts of different things, then actually you do need to have crop rotation, and that includes having pasture. And the best way of having pasture is by having animals on the land. So it's really important that we look at whether meat, you again, as a consumer, need to be quite discerning about making sure that when you buy meat, it is bought from a sustainable source and there's proper sustainable farming there. I would really love to see better regulation around the labelling of our food, so that it's not so you're not sort of squinting at a package, in a sort of Tesco shopping aisle. I think there needs to be much clearer labelling about the carbon footprint, the life cycle, the sustainability of where these things come from. So yes, you absolutely go and talk to your teachers. Yes, it's important that we all try to reduce our meat intake and particularly reduce red meat, but we absolutely shouldn't demonise farmers or meat producers, because we do need them to be the stewards of our land in the UK for food production more broadly.
Just on that, in my constituency, which is quite rural for this part of the world, I have lots of farmers, and including the deputy president of the NFU, who's a Harpenden farmer. And having spoken with him at length about this, and the NFU have done, and that's the National Farmers Union, for those who don't know, they've done a lot of work on this. And three things I want you to take away. The first is that Daisy's right about crop rotation and the importance of pasture, critical. The second is that it's not just sustainable farming methods you need in terms of the food you get, but also how far that food has to travel before it gets to the shop that you buy it or the butchers that you buy it from. So the food miles are critical. So shop local. And the third point I'd say is that it is very, very dangerous to try and demonize people who eat meat, or indeed people who don't seek to necessarily become vegetarian or vegan, not just for the obvious point that it's not nice to demonize people to making a choice, but because there are multiple biodiversity aspects to the food production, not just the crop rotation, but in terms of animals, in terms of the life cycles, in terms of the food chains, that get disturbed if those things get put out of whack too much. So there is a delicate balance in the countryside that needs to be maintained. And also remember that plant-based diets, a lot of plant-based diets are not necessarily as environmentally friendly as they look, because if you're having to fly a vegetable from, I don't know, thousands of miles away to a supermarket in the UK before you eat it, the carbon impact of that can often be a lot higher than having locally sourced, sustainably farmed meat.
Simon, as a Green Party representative, what do you have to say on this?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I mean, just to add and to emphasise, there is no question at all that we need to reduce our meat intake in the Western world. Yes, there are arguments around the edges of, yes, ruminants are of use on agricultural land. Yes, it depends where you get the meat from. Yes, don't fly your avocados in from New Zealand. But the fundamental basic case is that we need to do that. So we shouldn't be distracted by other arguments around that. I mean, just to build on what Daisy said, absolutely, as young people, if you've got school or college that you go there, you can get action there. Why is it always 3 meat choices and 1 veggie choice? Why can't it be the other way around? You're not demonizing anyone there. You're not demonizing vegetarians by saying you only got 1 choice. So we're not demonizing meat eaters by saying you've only got 1 choice. Might be interesting to try that and to see if students would support that. Make that food tastier and cheaper than the meat option. And there's a huge issue again around cost here, is that if the government is serious about people having healthy and environmentally friendly food choices, there should be tax advantages there that make that kind of food cheaper, so that people buy it because it's cheaper, it's tastier, and it's good for them and good for the planet. Also on education, let's educate people, let's educate children and grown-ups about the effect that food production has on our environment. It's not really talked about. There's a few great films around that people will know and will have seen Cowspiracy and Seaspiracy and so on. But in general education, how much information is there about that? If people understood that those choices that they made really had an effect on the world around them, I think that would be really powerful. Never mind the issue of how animals are raised and killed. You don't even have to go there. Some people might, you know, want you to see that stuff and consider that stuff, but you don't even have to go as far as addressing that issue. Is it right to kill animals just so that we can have a burger? Some people think that's the most important issue, but there's plenty of other things that can be talked about that would help people to make healthier and more environmentally friendly food choices.
Definitely. And I think that point that you and Daisy both made about kind of taking these arguments to the place that you work, that you go to school, that's really important. And it is a way that you can be empowered to sort of address these things yourself. Tina, do you have something to say on this?
I do. Thank you very much. So I want to start by agreeing with everything that Daisy and Bim have said around farming. And I think that, so rural policy is one of my passions, and I spend a lot of time researching this area and just speaking to people in the community. And I want to emphasize that supporting farmers and taking action on the climate, those are not things that contradict each other at all. But I want to bring this back to local government, and something that our district council, which is run by a joint administration of Labour and the Liberal Democrats, something that they do a lot of is promoting this idea of less waste. And I think that that is really, really important. And it's actually really interesting, the comment that's just been put in the chat, because I was just about to mention meat-free Mondays. This was something that we actually did at my old school. And I think that what that does is, again, it raises awareness from a different angle. And don't get me wrong, it was quite a difficult process. It's not something that's easy to do, but it's something that is well worth doing. And it's another way that we can promote sustainability around food choices.
Thank you very much. If we now move on to, we had a couple of questions about decarbonisation, and I think Bryn in particular was kind of sceptical of how enthusiastic government actually was about decarbonisation. And we had a question from Kirthana as well, who asked what the plans to accelerate use of renewable energy are, and how are local government and national government ensuring that they're executed. And I think in the chat we had a question about kind of building new coal power stations. So maybe Bim could address that as well.
Yeah, so let me take those in turn. In terms of how enthusiastic is the government about it, our record speaks for itself. So over the last 10 years, we're the leaders in the G7 in terms of decarbonising. So that doesn't mean there isn't more that we need to do, but compared to all other industrialised countries, we're leading the pack. So I think that, and don't just take my word for it, John Kerry, who's the United States representative, former Secretary of State and the representative for COP26, he has also said that as well. But in addition, what do we need to do? We've done a large part of the work on decarbonising energy. Now we need to move on as we are decommissioning, winding down some of the existing oil and gas-fired power stations that have been in place for a very long time. We've got nuclear station coming on stream, which I think is a critical part of this, and huge amounts more wind, huge amount more solar. And the price of wind and solar energy is now below almost any other type of energy. And that has all been down to the policy of the government over the last 10 years. The point on the coal mines, well, that we've stopped that. That was a good decision. So we've stopped that. And in terms of, I think it was in the chat around, I think it was Trident and a couple of other things. It's important when we deal with this issue, important though it is, that we don't say that, there's nothing else that money needs to be spent on. Money needs to be spent on a huge range of things in government. Defense of the realm is pretty important. That's why we need to make sure our Trident nuclear weapons system is there, because that helps protect us and keep us safe, in addition with all sorts of other things the government spends money on. It's not an either or, it's a, and. So I think we need to be doing decarbonisation and making sure our armed forces are in a good state, and various other things as well.
I go next?
Yeah, go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, just take what Bim said with a pinch of salt there. Being top of the G7 for renewables is not so great. That includes the US under Trump, and it includes Germany that's run on coal, and so on. So it's not such a great boast. And actually, there's a lot of government policy that's been terrible for renewables in this country, including slashing the subsidies or tax breaks, whatever you want to call them, for solar panels on houses and that sort of thing. So there's, if you ask the renewable energy sector in this country, they'd say there's a lot more that needs to happen. And bearing in mind that we are the top country, certainly in Europe, and probably one of the top ones in the world in terms of renewable energy resources. We are an island surrounded by wind and waves. We've got a lot of wind, but we're also quite a sunny country. So there's a huge amount more that we could do. But the amazing thing about renewables is that it's such a win-win, and it's so frustrating that the government talks about how great they are at renewables, but actually is not supporting the industry. It's a win-win because there's great UK industry that could be building so much more of this stuff. Yes, we've made advances. Yes, we've closed down coal, and to a large extent in this country, and that's been one of the main reasons why our emissions have gone down. That's the number one factor that makes the UK, not bottom of the league tables. But renewables is such a great opportunity for this country. It saves environment. It's great for the environment, obviously, but it creates loads and loads of really good, high quality jobs, really sustainable jobs in parts of the country that need jobs. You're not going to put up a massive wind farm in the middle of London. London, can have other jobs, but in parts of the country that are less fortunate and that need jobs, it's great. And it's not just wind and solar, there's wave power and all these sorts of ideas that have hardly even been looked at. So renewables is a really exciting sector. It's absolutely essential that we do that if we're going to successfully, transfer our transport into electric vehicles. We have to have a lot more electricity, and that electricity has to be generated renewably and ideally locally on site, rather than being sent all around the country, or even from country to country in big cables. So yeah, there's a huge amount to do on renewables. It's the number one thing, and you can do it locally as well. As I said before, solar panels on council houses, there's a lot you can do locally.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more contribution. Did you want to go, Daisy?
Yes, if that's okay, very quickly. So I'm just going to put in the chat here a link to the climate policy dashboard, which the APPG, the All Party Parliamentary Group, we're working on. Basically, the government slashed solar subsidies and really needs to get those going again. It was when my party leader Ed Davey was Climate Change Secretary of State, he forced and worked with the government to make sure that there was proper investment in wind power. And as Bim says, it is now the cheapest form of electricity generation. So what we really need is a government with that level of ambition to invest in renewable energies. The one thing that people don't talk about is the fact that we need long-term plans. There have been many schemes by lots of successive governments, actually, that have been short-term initiatives. The Green Homes Grant, the Decarbonization grant scheme, all these different grants come and go, and they always collapse because they're short-term. And what you need is a long-term strategy, because only when you have a long-term strategy does the business sector know that it can invest in it reliably, and colleges then invest in creating the apprenticeships and the skills training to produce the people that can then do the work. But at the moment, it's great if you provide money for people to insulate their homes, but if you haven't got people trained to do the installation or to drill the boreholes that are needed for new forms of heating your home, then actually those schemes are going to fall apart. So we actually need this long-term plan to tackle the decarbonisation agenda.
So Will, I see you wanted to say something earlier. Do you want to quickly jump in with that?
It's okay. Move us on to the next question.
Cool.
Had a good set of answers.
Yeah, cool.
Can I jump in very quickly?
Yeah,
great, thank you. So something that I wanted to bring up was renewable energy cooperatives, because we've talked a lot about what government can be doing, but there are things that we can be doing. And I just wanted to highlight that cooperatives are great for that, because governments come and go, but this is something that is sustainable.
Perfect, thank you very much. I think if we now move on to kind of dealing with youth engagement more directly. So we have a question from Jess. I don't know if she wants to say it or if, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say it straight. So as a young person who's recently turned 18, I heard a lot of my friends and people my age saying that council elections weren't really that important. But in this election, we saw the Greens making massive gains and the demographic is changing. So I just wanted to ask how you think that we can engage young people in politics further and ensure that their vote matters and tell them that.
Yeah, go ahead.
We've got, I think it's really important, the point you made about the Greens is well made. One thing that I'm 35 and I know that seems really old to you, but to most of my colleagues, I'm still really young. I'm really committed to getting as many young candidates as we can, because often I think the best way of reaching young people is to have people who are of a similar age to them as possible. So not just young people speaking to old politicians to try and put their point of view forward, but actually young candidates. And we've got one who asked a question at the beginning, Thomas Chapman, councillor for Redbourne, Conservative councillor, elected at the age of 18. And so one of the things that we're all we're going to rely on him for is to make sure he brings that young perspective and find other young people to get involved in politics directly, because I think that that's the best way of engaging young people.
Thank you. Simon, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question and one we hear a lot. I think there is a real vicious circle, unfortunately, in politics, that policies often feel like they're made by old people for old people. The classic example is pensions, and I've got nothing against pensions. I work in the pension sector, but the reason that politicians talk about pensions so much is because pensioners vote. So there's a natural tendency for politicians not to talk about young people's issues because there's not that many young people in politics, and young people are less likely to vote. And as a result, because politicians don't talk about it, young people are less likely to vote. And so there's this vicious circle that goes down. So it is really difficult when they do talk about young people's issues. It's kind of about education specifically, or it's about how schools and colleges can produce the workers of the future to run our glorious economy. So it's pretty uninspiring kind of stuff. So it is hard. It's a hard problem to fix. It's hard to make the case for how you really fix that. I certainly agree with Bim that young people standing for election is a key difference. But I would also say that if you're 18 or over, by all means put yourself up for election, but also that's not the only way to get involved. And even if you're too young to vote, you can still talk to particularly your local councillors, because actually your local councillors are by definition from the local area. There'll be people that who know them personally, and they have to care about what everyone thinks who lives where they are, not just the people who vote for them, not just people of voting age, and not just old people, but they have to care about young people too. And actually, I've been a councillor for 10, 11 years. And when I've seen young people come physically into the council and present a petition or sit around a table or ask a question at a council meeting, councillors really sit up and listen, because it doesn't happen very often. Councillors are very sensitive to that. So don't feel that you're shouting into the wind if you want to approaching your local councillor or your local council. Find out the person who represents your area and get them on the phone, or tell them to come around and see you, or go out for coffee with them, or whatever you want to do. Do a petition about something that you care about and present it to the council. The council will sit up and listen because you do have a voice. And if you're not yet a voter, you soon will be.
Thank you so much. That's really good advice. If we go to Tina and then Will.
Thank you. This is a great question. One of the things that politicians can do is exactly this. I also want to echo the point about young candidates and councillors. So I was initially selected just after my 18th birthday. So I'm putting that one out there. But something else I want to say is I want to get away from this idea of young people's issues, because I don't think there are young people's issues and old people's issues. I think it's about the collective and the collective good, and that's something that is so important with climate change. It needs to span, action on the climate needs to span across the board and cover everything. But I want to say that I think that local elections and local government really does matter. So we've talked about the community, and there's been a comment, I think, in the chat about the lack of accessibility to local politicians. So what I want to say is they will or should be signing pledges. So that's one way of knowing what they think. in addition to literature and door knocking, which was really crucial in my campaign. I think it's important that politicians attend events like this. I think it's important that they meet community groups. And then you've got social media, email, all of that sort of thing. But there are also two things that I want to very specifically say about the importance of local government. And that's, first of all, in this role as the Labour spokesperson on environment and waste, we were talking about procedure earlier. What I didn't get to say is this gives me the opportunity to be able to scrutinise what the Conservative administration of this council are actually doing. But what's more than that, it gives me the chance to bring ideas directly, and it means that we're able to have that collaboration. And the last thing that I want to say on this point, just to highlight how much it really does matter. So my predecessor had a majority of 107 votes. That's 2%. My majority is 46 votes. That as a percentage is 1%. So every vote does count, and it should. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Will?
Well, building on the 46 vote win, we've got a few kind of double digit margins in St Albans district as well. So it really is true pretty much everywhere in St Albans district area that every vote does count. I think my main advice would be like Jess. So Jess has been coming to the advisory group the climate advisory group meetings, giving us insights into the things that she, and through her other younger people that you're in touch with, Jess, are kind of keen for us to be acting on, and getting involved in setting up things like this. So I think be like Jess would be a good tip. I guess the other thing, I'm kind of building on that, is party politics isn't the only way to be involved, right? Get involved in Friends of the Earth, get involved in Oxfam, or in any of the other NGOs and charities that are really active on conservation issues or climate issues, environmental issues, global issues. Get involved. The last thing I would say is, as Lib Dems and actually as Greens, we want your vote to count even more, because we support a fairer voting system. And at the moment, in the first past the post system, in most of the country, it's going to go to the same old lot. And we need a fairer voting system in order that we can have a more proportional set of MPs particularly, but also local council representation. Daisy might want to build on that.
Thanks. Yeah, just two or three quick things. I think I agree with a lot of what's already been said. The first is that, I mean, one of the reasons why I support votes at 16 is because that would actually give young people the education in school, as you know, to understand the political system and to get more engaged. And actually, there are people of all ages who find elections confusing. They don't know who they're voting for. They don't understand the differences in different levels of government. And that's not just restricted to young people. There are people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s who I meet who don't understand which election there is coming up and which election they're voting in. So getting that education in school, as you know, through votes at 16 would set people up for life, not just so they could vote earlier on. The second thing I would say is that, yes, if you're interested in party politics, by all means, get involved, stand for election. But as Will and others have said, you know, you can get involved in all sorts of ways, and particularly with the climate movement. You know, you might be the kind of person that likes going to committee meetings. You might be the kind of person that likes making placards. You might be the kind of person who, you know, wants to sort of spray paint yourself and, you know, get a megaphone. You might be an entrepreneur who wants to set up your own sort of green company. Do what it is that you enjoy, that you're good at, and play to your strengths. And I guess the last thing I would say, I don't know whether there'll be a question on this, but I know that sometimes there is a call for sort of youth councils or meetings of young people in particular. And I have to be honest, I don't really like those, because I've been part of them when I was younger, and as an adult I've been involved in running them. They're not part of the decision-making process. They're quite a good experience for young people to learn how to make arguments and to get the confidence in speaking and to exchange views. But if you really want to make a difference, if you want to influence decision makers, you have to take part in the political process. And whether you're 6 or 66, you need to get involved in the processes that are set up to do that, and not be sidelined and just be sort of labelled as being, you know, young people that are speaking about young people's issues.
Thank you very much. We had a question come up during this chat as well, on the Q&A, about people saying that they just won't ever be interested in voting, and how we can use education to interest people in politics. I don't know if anyone on the panel has any thoughts on that, how to use education to really encourage people to vote or convince them of it being an important thing.
Can I just say, I think people learn that voting is important when they vote and they see something happen as a result of that. Sorry, my cat has come to join the call. But I think that when you do vote for the first time, and you see that person make a decision as a result of your vote to elect them, and that's what really matters. So as I say, I believe in votes at 16, because that would then give people the education. I've seen loads of examples around St Albans in various schools where they've had fake hustings or moot hustings. They've had political debates. There's Parliament Week, where you learn not only how Parliament works, but also you run your own elections on particular issues. You can make up fake parties, political parties. So I took part in an event with some brownies where I think there was a free sweeties party. I think there was an end homelessness party. There was a save the planet party. And then they voted for the things that mattered most to them. And so I think getting people involved in the process of voting on things that they care about is the first step to getting them involved in party politics as a whole.
Perfect, thank you. So if I move on to we asked a question in our survey around the obstacles that people feel that young people face in getting involved in tackling the climate and ecological emergency, particularly on a local level. And if I just kind of read out some of their responses and then hear your responses to their thoughts. So from Helen, we had the idea that the lack of understanding of the severity in St Albans, national and globally, of the impact of the climate crisis is an issue, in that we're taught that there is the problem of climate change, but it's framed as a future issue and not one of right now. Lack of information about how impactful their actions can be. So it's again kind of harking back to the idea that if you adopt a less red meat based diet, you can have that impact, and that does have an impact kind of on the aggregate. And yes, it's those ideas how can we overcome those obstacles where people aren't educated in that way, which I guess also harks back to what we've just spoken about, but I guess in addressing those obstacles to getting involved locally more broadly. Yeah, Will?
So there's actually quite a lot of research into what encourages people to take green action, green and climate friendly action. And what a lot of that shows is that being supportive of even little steps is the way to encourage greater steps to be taken. So even if the first thing that you get someone to do is just switching off a light, or not driving to work one day, or doing something that's quite a small step, supporting that decision, that individual's decision, and encouraging them to kind of ratchet it up, that's what all the evidence suggests is the route to getting people to be more ambitious and to taking all of the actions that we need to all take as individuals. I think as a kind of rule of thumb, I mean, as I mentioned, I ran Oxfam's climate change campaign, so unfortunately I've seen floods in Zambia where tens of thousands, as far as you could see, had flooded people out of their houses. And similarly in Rajasthan in India, I've seen, again, as far as you could see, drought-ridden farms where people couldn't survive on the land. Those stories are really sad. They make you feel the pain, you empathise and you feel the pain of people. Unfortunately, the research shows that isn't generally motivating for people. People want to feel empowered, they want to feel supported to do what's right. They don't want to feel guilty because they didn't switch the light off or they didn't put the extra 4 inches of insulation in their loft when they could have done. So I think encourage people to do the things that they can do, and that will encourage them to do more as and when they can. And we can create what's called a social norm, a kind of sense that everyone else is doing it, so I'm going to do it too. But that's the route to success in terms of the behaviour change, the individual behaviour change.
I contribute 2 very quick things. One on education. I'm a supporter of the Teach the Future campaign. Teach the Future is a campaign for better climate education in schools. Basically it would be a piece of legislation that would encourage the government and basically mandate schools effectively to teach young people about the effects of climate change and actually prepare them for the future of climate change, but also explain what the sort of future green jobs are going to be as well, and start gearing our skills agenda towards that. So there is a campaign calling for better climate education. I definitely support that. And secondly, I would support what Will has said. There are lots of different steps that people can take. I think it's Friends of the Earth that has a little kind of scorecard or something. I've had it before, which has like 25 steps to being a climate hero or something, and you incrementally ramp up the things that you're doing. And some of them are very easy. Watch this film. Watch this video clip because you will learn something from it, and that's good for education. But there are other steps like reducing your water waste. That's a big campaign I've been supporting here in St Albans. Reduce your plastic waste and have a reusable water bottle. Working on a plastic-free bathroom. I think I'm about 90% of the way there, but still working on it. But there are these little steps that you can take, and then moving up to bigger ones. But that kind of climate scorecard that encourages you and others to get competitive about seeing who can be the best climate hero is a really good way of incentivizing people to take action.
Can I just add one other thought? Is one of the good things about politics and party politics is that actually you don't need to persuade everyone of something in order for change to happen. Extinction Rebellion talk about a very small percentage of people necessary, and history shows that when big changes need to happen, you need to take everybody with you in one way, but you don't need everybody to know everything and for everybody to all stand up at the same time and all demand something. You just need enough people. So don't be disheartened if some people kind of don't seem to get it or don't seem to think it's important. Look at, think about the difference that what we see on TV today, even compared to 2 years ago, in terms of what people are talking about, the kind of programs that are on prime time now that were not on 2 years ago, that are talking about the environment and the climate crisis. Take heart from that. Take heart from all these groups that are set up and people who do think in a similar way to you, and support them as well, because actually they're the people who together are going to get that change made and bring along people who are not quite as sure but need to come along on the journey. We don't need to convince everybody. That's not how it works. It's just not necessary, and it's actually, to be frank, a waste of time to try and convince 100% of people that this is so severe that we need immediate and revolutionary change. So don't worry about that. But also, look at what has changed, and look at what people are talking about it. Yes, in year 9 geography at the moment, it's just sort of something in the future. But no one could look back at the stories from the past year about what we've seen around the world, from wildfires and so on, and say that that's not climate change. And clearly it is. So we are increasingly seeing things that people cannot deny are a taste of a future that we want to do something to avoid.
Thank you very much. Definitely a note of optimism to kind of note the change that we have experienced in the past few years. I think.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah, really quickly, just in the interest of time,
Yeah.
we can get on to the last question.
Excellent. So I think what's key here is talking about climate change, and I want to highlight something I read in Sky News yesterday, and that's that students feel held back. And part of that, like Daisy said, is because there isn't this mandatory education, and that makes you feel quite dispirited and it makes you quite anxious. I mean, there's no denying that climate anxiety is a thing, but I also want to bring into this inclusivity. I think that the way in which the movement is portrayed and the way in which this issue is communicated to bring people with us is really, really important, so that students don't feel held back, so that we're all able to take the change that we know needs to happen.
Thank you very much. And that kind of leads us on quite well to the last section that I want to address, which was in kind of talking about obstacles. A lot of people were talking about a lack of empowerment. So, for example, Georgina was talking about a lack of chances for young people to talk to people that have power over the situation. And as we've discussed already today, get in touch with a local councillor. You can seek out those opportunities and they are available to you. And then also, I guess, there was the one from Olivia, and she was talking about the power that children and young people have to make change, and whether there is a way that local government can sort of tune into what young people are saying. So, for example, we've got Jess on the Climate Advisory Group. Is there a way that it can be made easier for young people's voices to be heard? And do you guys have any thoughts on that? Yeah, Bim?
I think young people's voices are being heard on this issue. If I think back to even 5 years ago, this is just not a subject that was being examined in the level of depth that it is today. Now, why I say that is not, and I repeat, not to be complacent about the very difficult decisions we need to make strategically and economically in order to achieve net zero. But it is to say that I believe that the biggest driving force, right from I was in Parliament when the government under Theresa May legislated for net zero by 2050, and I was in Parliament that day and I spoke in that debate. If I take that point at one moment, the change, not just in this country, but in other countries across the world, I believe has been driven by young people. It has not been driven by people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and over. I fundamentally believe young people have driven this, and that's through the multiplicity of voices, ranging from speaking to parents, speaking to local politicians, demonstrations, articles, blogs, social media, the full thing. And so what I would say is now, and the voice of young people is being heard, and I do believe it's generational, this challenge, is that we need to now engage with some of the tough trade-offs. And I would urge everybody listening to this not to listen to anybody who suggests for you that any of these things are going to be easy, that it's simple, what we need to just do is X, or just stop people doing this or stop people doing that and everything's going to be fine, because actually these things all have trade-offs, and they will be very difficult for certain people who may work in certain things or may do a certain job or may live in a certain part of the country, or indeed in a certain part of the world. And I think that now what young people need to be doing, in addition to providing their voice that this is important, is to be now thinking, what are the trade-offs now? What are the things we want our government to prioritize? And what are the things we think we should prioritize? And engage at that level of debate. And again, things like the advisory group, local politics, national politics, and all of those things are good at that. But that's really, and I know, the obvious answer to these things is often to say, no, we need, more young voices. Actually, I think young people's voices are being heard, but now we need to make those voices heard on the difficult policy trade-offs as well.
Can I just, as a comment on that? I mean, I think, I really do hear it loud and clear that a lot of young people are very scared. And I'm not surprised, because we have 9 years left to stop irreversible damage to this planet. And for perhaps some people on this call, or maybe siblings or school friends, those 9 years will be up before they even get a chance to vote. So it's not surprising that politics feels like something that isn't accessible to them. I think it is important that that young people feel heard and are listened to. I do my very best to go into local schools. I respond to all the letters I get from young people, particularly on this issue. But what I would say is, I think BIM is right up to a point. There will be some issues where there are trade-offs, right? So a frequent flyer tax is one where there will be a trade-off. Some people will, if we introduced a frequent flyer tax, then some people would have to pay more money for flying. Not everybody. Most folk having one holiday a year wouldn't have to pay anything at all, but some people that fly regularly would have to pay more. That's where there's a trade-off. However, there are other climate issues where there isn't a trade-off and where there is a win-win. So insulating homes, for example, is an example where actually you reduce fuel poverty because people don't have to spend all their money paying for heating because their homes are actually warm enough. You reduce carbon emissions and you actually create green jobs. So there are actually quite a lot of schemes where you do get a win-win. And what we really need is a much greater level of ambition, I believe, from the government to create the green jobs of the future. Because if the government says over the next 10 years, we're going to invest in the skills and the upskilling and we're going to create these green jobs, then anybody else who's in a job which is going to effectively become redundant will be able to swap into a green job of the future. And it's incumbent on government to set up those schemes so people can actually have that just transition from one sector to another. So it is entirely possible, but it does require ambition and it requires action. It won't always be easy and we won't always agree, but that's part of the responsibility of being in government. You've got to make some tough choices.
Daisy's right, but the only way she was wrong is that I didn't say that there weren't things that didn't require trade-offs. I was just talking about the trade-offs that existed. Other than that, I think Daisy was right on that last point. How about that?
Can I go next?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure to what extent young people's voices are being heard. I think they're starting to be heard. I think there are now some people in positions of influence and power in government in this country and across the world who are listening to young people's voice and are thinking, you know, what is my responsibility as someone who's been put in that position, who's been voted in? What is my responsibility to the current generation and the generation after? And it doesn't need to go any further than that before we start getting in trouble if we don't do anything. So there are people considering those things. You know, the hard truth is that, you know, young people do not have political power directly. If you're not 18 in this country anyway, you can't stand and get elected. And even if you could, there would be one voice amongst many. So it's important that young people use their voices, both if you're 18 to vote, but also to make your presence felt in other ways as well. I think so. People have talked about, you know, other organisations that you can join and going on demos and, you know, writing letters, whatever it is. Because I think it won't, I'm sure none of the politicians on this call would claim that everything can be solved by politics or by politicians, but they are a very important part of the answer. But there's a lot else you can do, you know, and I think Ben mentioned, you know, kind of talking to parents. Pester power is another thing, you know, Will talked about what works. Pester power works. You know, if you can convince the people who love you, the parents and the adults around you who love you, that you care about this issue and that they should be thinking about using their vote and their voice in this debate, in this argument, that can be really, really powerful, as well as some of the other things. So there are different ways for your voice to be heard. I am encouraged that people in power are starting to talk the right language, I think, but I think there's a very, very long way to go on that.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we've got time for, but that's a good note to end on. We've kind of got some threads of optimism and also an idea of how much more work there is to do. Just to, first of all, thank our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. It's been such an interesting conversation and also one that spans such a wide breadth of topics. So it's well done for kind of keeping with me as I TikTok all over the place. And then to our attendees, thank you so much for coming. I will hand over to Jess to quickly chat to you about how you can keep in touch with us. And then we'll be free to go.
Yes, so thank you again for all of the questions you submitted, both pre-submitted and on the night. If you enjoyed this event, it has been recorded, so we'll send you the link after with the Eventbrite, so please share it with any friends who are unable to attend. We'll also be sending a follow-up email about some exciting opportunities for young people to get involved with. such as becoming a young trustee of Sustainable St Albans, and joining Neve, Nina, Maddie and I, who created this event in our Sustainable St Albans Youth Advisory Group. As Maddie and Will also said, I have been on the St Albans Council's Climate Advisory Group this last year, and that's been really insightful to just see what the councillors do. So Will Tucker has chaired this group and Simon Grove is on it, and it really gives you a see on what the council do, and like you can have a say in that. So if anyone is interested in filling that role when I go to uni next year, please email this youth@sustainablestalbans.org. Or if you're interested in any of the other things that I mentioned, like the young trustee or becoming part of a Sustainable St Albans advisory group, please get in touch with us and have a great evening. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you very much.